Chromosomal inheritance helps us understand the transmission of genes, and a lot of disorders have to do with the inheritance of mutated alleles or non-disjunction. So again, genetic variation comes from meiosis. During meiosis 1, during synapsis, we can have crossing over, but ultimately we swap up, we mix up and separate these homologous chromosomes. So as we continue on in meiosis 2, we separate those sister chromatids and end up with daughter cells that are all unique. So with that idea, if there is something wrong, it can be passed on to the daughter cells. So again, when we think about chromosomes, if you look closely at the chromosomes, they have DNA. And if you look at the DNA, there could be mutations. And if there's a mutation here, it could get replicated and then passed on to the daughter cells, which end up being sex cells. So a mutation in one generation can get passed on to further generations. So again, when we think about fertilization, there's a chance, right? Not necessarily every single sperm or every single egg will have the mutation passed on to it because there is variation. But when we combine sperm and egg, we're combining those chromosomes, and we might be, as we combine those, we might be allowing the mutation to pass on to the next generation. So when we think about inherited mutations, again, mutations, we think about letters of the codes being wrong, where maybe we have a point mutation where there's a substitution, one letter is wrong. You could have an insertion or a deletion, which causes a frame shift mutation. A lot of times we think of mutations happening at a specific time and not necessarily passed on. But when we think about sickle cell, again, it's a simple point mutation here, which creates one change in an amino acid for a part of the hemoglobin, which causes this distinct, makes it sticky and makes this distinct red blood cell shape. Again, everyone with sickle cell didn't have this mutation happen to them. It has been passed on from generation to generation. So again, this mutation for sickle cell happens on the 11th chromosome. So when we look at this, it's on this 11th chromosome and it's up here. And again, we still think about homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. If you have one copy of the messed up gene, you would be heterozygous. And again, both of these chromosomes, one would be from mom, one would be from dad. The protein, the hemoglobin protein, is going to be made from both chromosomes. So it's not like one chromosome just overpowers the other chromosome and proteins are only made from the DNA on one chromosome. Ultimately, the DNA is made from both of these chromosomes. So if someone is heterozygous and has a wild type normal functioning hemoglobin, half of the red blood cells will be normal, but then half of them will be sickle shaped. If someone has sickle cell anemia, all of their proteins are going to be dysfunctional. So one thing about this that makes it unique and passed on for generations and generations and generations is because of malaria. So although sickle cell anemia is a disease, if you are a carrier for sickle cell, you actually are much less prone to be infected by this plasmodium in your red blood cells that get transferred through mosquitoes. So you're less likely to be sick from malaria if you're a carrier for sickle cell. But as we go on, we think about these carriers. These carriers would have an advantage when it comes to being susceptible to malaria. So this could proceed throughout the generations. But again, when we think about our Punnett squares, we can end up with those homozygous recessive traits getting passed on into sickle cell. So another example would be Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs disease comes from a mutation that has occurred on chromosome 15. It will end up making a a protein enzyme that does not break down this substance. If this substance cannot be broken down, it's going to build up inside of neurons or nerve cells, which causes a lot of problems. So we think of what kind of disorder it is. It's autosomal because it is on chromosome 15 and not a sex cell. And it's recessive. In order for someone to have Tay-Sachs, they have to have the broken protein on both broken gene, which causes a non-functional protein, that broken protein on both of their chromosome 15s. So when we start thinking about pedigrees here, this kind of pedigree should jump out at you as an autosomal recessive pedigree because you have two people that do not have the disease, but then they could both be carriers and produce an offspring that has it. Again, here's that same example, here's that same example. Again, these would be heterozygous individuals. So not all of their children are going to have it because they could pass on the dominant allele and they would not have it. However, if they both pass on the recessive allele for this broken protein, their children would have the disease. And when you look at some pedigrees do also show the carriers by half shading in circles. And again, it's these two carriers that create children that have it because they would be homozygous recessive and have Tay-Sachs. Huntington's is another example. Again, Huntington's occurs because of a problem with the DNA on chromosome 4. There's a lot of these extra repeats within this particular gene, which creates an expanded protein. And this expanded protein does not carry out the function that the protein is supposed to do, and it actually becomes a toxin, and it causes degeneration in a person's brain. And it's autosomal, but because it's from chromosome 4, however, it is a dominant gene, a dominant disease. So a person does not need both copies of this in order to exhibit this problem. They only need a single one. So when we start thinking about autosomal dominant traits, we can see it could skip generations. So if both of these individuals would have the disease and be heterozygous, they could have a child that does not have the disease, and this child would have to be homozygous recessive. But again, if these individuals have even just a single chromosome with the broken protein, they will exhibit Huntington's. Color blindness, again, there's many different kinds of color blindness, but this particular version exists within the cones of your retina. And again, genes code for proteins. And it's this opsin protein that interacts with the light and sends a cellular signal that allows us to see color. But it exists on the X, this particular protein, and the gene that it comes from is on the X chromosome, so we say this type of color blindness is X-linked. So when we think about the X, again, we're kind of adding these dominant and recessive letters. The dominant works, and the recessive does not work. There's something wrong with the gene that when light hits this protein is somehow dysfunctional and does not send a cellular signal. So as we go on here, again, if we think about this X capital A, X lowercase a, this would be a female and she would be a carrier. Again, if it's a male, they don't have two X's, they would have a Y. And this unaffected father is going to pass on his Y to his sons, and he's going to pass on his X's to his daughters. So mom here, she is going to pass on, while she can see color, her son that gets the broken gene here for that protein would be colorblind, regardless of what the Y says. And again, she could pass it on, and her daughter could be a carrier, and her other daughter could have completely normal vision and not a carrier. And again, when we start looking at X-linked recessive diseases on pedigrees, a lot of times what jumps out right away is that it's mostly males that are going to actually that are going to actually have the disease. And when we look at these types of pedigrees that have carriers shown, the only way a daughter could have it is if dad also has it and mom is a carrier, because she has to have both versions of the broken gene on both of her X's in order to actually be colorblind. So again, we understand that chromosomes pass on genes from generation to generation, and a lot of those disorders can be tied into an inheritance of mutated alleles. And